Union of European Federalists. Hello and welcome to our UEF podcast special on the occasion of today's International Day of Press Freedom. The UN General Assembly proclaimed the World Press Freedom Day in 1993, so exactly 30 years ago, and the day is meant to be a reminder to governments of the need to respect their commitment to press freedom. In time, it became also a day of reflection among media professionals. This year's focus of the UNESCO for today is the freedom of expression as a driver for all other human rights. In this episode, we will take a closer look at the shape of the media landscapes in Europe and key global hotspots to illuminate some of the areas of current challenges for the human right of free speech and for the functioning of the media as the so-called fourth estate, meaning its democracy political crucial role for controlling those who are in power, be it governments or economy. I'm looking forward to a broad spectrum of perspectives on these topics from our distinguished experts today. We will start our special with Professor Paul Lendvai. It's a great pleasure to have you here with us. Thank you very much for your precious time.
Thank you for inviting me.
I will try to introduce you very briefly, although I have to say your life's journey was much richer than the upcoming few sentences can depict. You have been an European journalist and analyst of the European political scene for decades now. You're an expert, especially for Central and Eastern European development, and you were born in Hungary yourself, in Budapest, in 1929, and live in Vienna, Austria, since 1957. You've been a lifelong political publicist and journalist, from the London Financial Times in the beginning to the UEF, the Austrian Broadcasting Corporation. You wrote 19 books by now. The latest, with the title Austria Behind the Mask, will be published in English now in upcoming July, and you are working on your 20th book. You also received numerous national and international awards. And now we come to question number one. A heavy question. We come to Russia. The war in Ukraine has proven not only to be a battlefield in the classical sense, but to become a media-related battlefield as well. Disinformation campaigns, manipulation of public opinion on the one side, and openly fighting critical journalism and journalists on the other. Those strategies paint a very dark picture, actually, of Russia's current media strategy. So my question to you would be, how would you describe and assess the situation in Russia when it comes to press freedom these days?
Journalists are nowhere liked, particularly not liked by politicians, if they write the truth or they ask critical questions. It's particularly bad when there is an authoritarian system or a dictatorship. In Russia, we have now an authoritarian system and a dictatorship. It is a question for disputes among East experts, social experts on Russia, whether it's still authoritarian or is it already a totalitarian system. But this has nothing to do with your question, because the situation for the media and for the journalists is so bad that there is no point in making fine distinction between the various definitions of Russia today. That it has happened that an American journalist, an American citizen, imprisoned and accused of spying in 2023 is worse than the situation was in Stalinist times. Even Stalin didn't dare to jail the correspondent of the New York Times or Washington Post. Ivan Gershkovich, whose parents came from Russia, who loved this country, has been living there for 6 years, has written in numerous articles. I've read them, very distinguished, very critical, but not going beyond the limits of criticism, showing the economic situation. This is something unparalleled. But it is also at the same time a sign of the fear of the leadership in Russia. They fear the open world, the free media, and this is something which shows that the regime is not so strong as it seems to be. Also, there is not only the question of Ivan Gershkovich from the Wall Street Journal, but even journalists are attacked who are not in Russia but write about Russia. For instance, the very good Swiss journalist based in Vienna, correspondent of the Neue Zürcher Zeitung, Ivo Meitzen, wrote a piece about a city which is occupied now in the Ukraine by Russia. And he was attacked and threatened by the Russian embassy in Bern, in the capital of Switzerland, with a fine, or not a fine, but rather a term of 2 to 5 years prison if he would go to Russia, because he is regarded as someone who assists terrorism. I am saying mentioning these two examples to show what the situation in Russia is today and why it is so dangerous for anyone to write about the situation who lives there, and even those who write from abroad.
Very interesting, your first assessment, and it draws a big picture about the importance of press freedom, actually. And my next question would be concerning those measures of trying to control the public opinion. Do you have the feeling, is Russia's behavior and media strategy also influencing European states, perhaps even becoming a role model for some EU member states? Did you see some similarities in some states or some approaches towards the Russian way?
Well, Russia influences, it's a big country, and what happens there, it influences also the world. And Russia is not alone. You have the figures, how many journalists have been killed or being imprisoned, and it's not a profession which is very favorable under the conditions of authoritarian systems that you see in Turkey, and even you see it within the European Union. Because if you look at the situation, for instance, in Hungary, then you must say that the Hungarian regime is perhaps more sophisticated in suppressing press and media freedom. People are not jailed, but the possibility of reaching the public is not there, because public radio, television, and most newspapers are either in the hands of the state or in the hand of the so-called oligarchs, very rich entrepreneurs who are friends of the number one man, the strong man in Hungary, the Prime Minister Viktor Orban. So, practically speaking, there is not much difference what people can learn about their countries between Russia or Hungary, but Hungary is, at the moment, still more of an open country. You can travel there, you can leave the country, and you can write what you want as long as you have a website or small newspapers which appear with a very, very limited circulation. Mm-hmm. But you have other countries too, which are candidates for membership in the European Union, as for example Serbia, which is also on the way to the same situation as Hungary. And then there are great fights also in Poland over the press freedom, but in Poland is the situation considerably better. But anyhow, you have to fight for press freedom, and it is very sad if uh, the key persons in the European Union do not understand and don't do enough to protect journalists and to criticize the countries, the regimes, the governments which suppress press freedom.
Let's stay with the global situation for a bit more. Before moving to more European-centered questions, we all remember the uprising of disinformation, of so-called alternative facts, and with that, of course, of fake news in the time of former US President Donald Trump. How do you see the current developments in the US in dealing with, for example, fake news? And how do you see the developments of the media landscape in the US in the last years coming to a current state assessment?
I think in the US, luckily, the print media still represent the high standard. The New York Times, Washington Post, Wall Street Journal. But of course, there is also a danger when the media are in the hands of people who only want to maximize profits and don't pay attention to the interests of the country and of freedom and the values which the United States, ever since its was set up, represents. So in that respect, the Fox agency or Fox Transmitters Incorporated, which belongs to the Murdoch Empire, is a bad example and shows that the manipulation of news can be also very dangerous in a democratic society. But there are pre-elections, but the elections can be also influenced and manipulated. Anyhow, the point is that, for instance, every evening, 3 million people saw Tucker Carlson, who was spreading half-truths, lies, nonsenses, conspiratory theories, at the same time in private chats and mails expressed his outrage over Trump, whom he was praising when he was on television. So that this man lost now his job. Whether it's a good sign or not, I hope it's a good sign that even the Fox News agency and the Fox TV broadcaster doesn't go beyond certain limits. There was a trial where a company which was unjustly, illegally accused of manipulating the elections sued Fox and in an agreement got $900 million or $800 million. And this was partly also the reason for sacking Carlson, because he was playing a great role in spreading the lies. But it is a danger, and we shall see with the coming elections 2024 how far the radios, television, social media can be controlled by the democratic institutions. That the richest man in the world also has Twitter and made various statements which allowed people like Trump, either using this institution, this possibility to influence public opinion, is not good. But anyhow, in the US, there is a fight for the freedom, for the values, and it is a battle which perhaps can still be won by those who who regard values higher than profits.
Let's switch to Europe. Where do you see the biggest challenges for the European media landscape at this time in history? How would you assess the situation? Also, perhaps in countries like Hungary or other Eastern European countries right now?
Well, Hungary is now for 12 years under the powerful control of Viktor Orban, who is a very clever operator and who manages to allow certain freedoms, but keeping the main option, the possession of power for himself, for his family, and for his friends. And any newspaper, any television or radio broadcaster who threatens this monopoly of power will be brought to silence. That is, they are not imprisoned or jailed, the journalists or the editors, but they don't get any advertising. They cannot spread their news and advertise. So in the end, 80 to 90% of the information is controlled by the government or by very rich entrepreneurs who are closely allied with the government of Viktor Orban. So that the situation is bad. In Poland, the situation is better because the civil society is stronger and the opposition too. But there are countries which aspire to become members of the European Union, like Serbia or even Turkey, which are also on the road to an authoritarian system. In Turkey, journalists have been jailed. In Serbia, there is also no real freedom of information. So the situation is mixed. And then, of course, there are also attempts to influence the media in Germany, in France, through money, through agents, and it is not a black and white picture. Much depends also on the journalists themselves, that they stick to the truth as they see it, and that they are not willing to become slaves of the owners or the publishers. And this is something which is in every country a fight, even in the United Kingdom, where the BBC, the model of free, balanced, unfettered reporting, even during wartime, is now under pressure by the weak conservative government. So the freedom of the media is nowhere totally assured. That's why it is so important on days like this, 30 years anniversary, to remember what can happen if you are not fighting for the freedom of the press. That's not a question of phrases. That's not a question of promises. It's a question of daily fight in your life, in your activities, in your work as a journalist, as a reader, to protect the people who try to write the truth as they see.
So we need actually several stakeholders to keep our human rights actively and in charge and be valued. We need the citizens, we need the society, we need the media, we need the journalists, we need, of course, also the political will. And now I would come to my last series of questions concerning actually about the possibility and the potential of the EU to protect and to foster human rights, as well as, for example, to found and strengthen a diverse media landscape and so on. Where do you see the EU's potential for protecting, fostering press freedom? What could the EU do better, do more?
There is the question, the basic question, that there is a difference between the European Parliament and the European Commission. The European Parliament has done and is doing much more to force East European countries like Hungary or Poland to stick to the law and don't demolish or destroy the legal system. It is a very long battle. And the European Commission, where the commissioners have been selected by the individual 27 states, is a kind of organization of the political balance. So unfortunately, sometimes there are compromises which are rotten compromises, immoral compromises. And that's why it is extremely important that the pressure of the European Parliament and the right of the European Parliament to control the European Commission should be strengthened. And the European Commission should consist of people who are really good in their own fields. Unfortunately, sometimes people are sent to Brussels who lost the political battle or whom the people at home want to get rid of. And I am not going into details. And it is also a question of the chairmanship or the chairwomanship of the Commission. So it is the price you are paying for democracy, but I think that the situation is now better. But one has to remember that the European Parliament already in 2011, 1 year after Orban seized power, warned against the abuse and the restrictions of press freedom in Hungary. And it's now 11 years later, there are still discussions whether Hungary or Poland will get less money and less from the funds from the more developed Western European countries to help them. So it is still an open question, but the situation is perhaps slightly better than a few years ago. We shall see what will happen, but I think that the European Union has a key position because the countries which are members of the European Union have to be forced to respect and to protect the values, and the same is true of the countries which aspire to become members of the European Union. So I hope that the European Union will learn from the mistakes of the past and will take also the fight for press freedom, media freedom, human rights more seriously and more consequently than it has done it until now.
Thank you so much for that. We come to my last question. It's actually concerning the European Federalists. We are recording today for the Union of European Federalists, and those are the people who would like to have a stronger Europe, a stronger community. And my question would be, where would you wish for a stronger Europe? For example, do we need? What kind of new legislation or new rules do we need? More rights, for example, on the European level instead of the national levels? Is there anything that you personally would wish for that could help to protect a free press and democracy and human rights?
I think everything which helps the European Union and the European institution is good. There are people who dream, as you know, of a European army. But I think that in a very curious way, the aggressive war, unprovoked war of Russia against the Ukraine misfired. It helped to strengthen so far and not to weaken European solidarity. And I wish, first of all, that Europe should remain united in supporting the Ukraine, because in the Ukraine, the Ukrainians are not only fighting for themselves, but also for us, for the protection of the freedom of the free societies. And so I think that's one of the most important things. And I hope that the European Parliament will have even more competences, and that the European Commission should be strengthened also that, for instance, the prosecution, the attorneys, should be able in all the member countries to see and to trace the people who are guilty of corruption or embezzling. So there are many fields where where the European Union should be strengthened. I personally wish more and more Europe and less nationalism. But unfortunately, in the history and in politics, the wishes are not always, or perhaps even very rarely fulfilled. But I wish you and your comrades fighting for more Europe and stronger Europe all the best.
Thank you so much. That was a great interview. Thank you for your time. I wish you all the best and all your efforts and a lot of energy for writing books, giving interviews. And thanks again very much.
Thank you.
Union of European Federalists.